Good afternoon, everybody. So welcome to Out and About, our forum for the Social Politics and Geopolitics cluster. I'm Annabelle, and with Yong Chen, both of us recent graduates of the MEMAC program, will be your moderators for this session. So to preface, this is part of the MEMAC show series of discussions put on by the Masters of Architecture cohort from 2021 from National University of Singapore. The MEMAC show is a celebration of the body of work put forward by our cohort of 2021. So while every student has produced an individual thesis of their own as accumulation of their architectural education, this year's show loosely locates them into 5 clusters, each with a different discourse within the discipline. So the works within this cluster interrogate architecture's capacity to contribute to the public good. Field work and research bring to light fissures in the built environment. Through conciliation, mediation, or critique, they take aim at social hierarchies, boundaries, notions of work, welfare, and education, imagining potential futures in which these status quos might be destabilized. They reassert the optimism and power of design. So today we are very happy to bring to you Out and About. So the architecture thesis often acts as a vehicle for a student to take aim at dominant ideology, policy, and hierarchies. So in doing so, the student must grapple with how they inhabit the position of the other. The conversation surfaces the stories of several students who have lived the thesis, how they have immersed themselves within the roles, enlisted in the groups that they speak for, and returned to tell the tale. So we're very pleased to have with us 2 guests today, which is Dr. Lilian Chee, Associate Professor and co-leader of the Research by Design cluster at the Department of Architecture at NUS. So her work is situated at the intersections of architectural representation, gender, and affect in a contemporary interdisciplinary context. So her research explores the emergence of architecture through and from within everyday encounters and its archives. And also Marianna Janowicz, a London-based architect, researcher, and member of feminist design collective EDIT. So some of EDIT's recent projects include the design of the exhibition, How We Live Now, an accompanying publication for the Barbican Centre in London, and Gross Domestic Product, exhibited at the Oslo Architecture Triennale at 2019. So EDIT is currently working on a short film commissioned by the Maxi Museum in Rome, in which they are exploring the domestic boundaries through the subject of laundry. So Yong Chen, please.
Yeah, we're also very proud to introduce our 4 student presenters today. We have Naz, Gabriel, Rachel, and Chike. So without further ado, I think I'll pass the time to Naz, who will present Pleasure Fields, Negotiating Queer Space and Time. Naz, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Let me just share my screen. All right. So I'm Naz, and today I'll be sharing my thesis, Pleasure Fields, Negotiating Queer Space and Time. So my thesis aims to negotiate queer space and time in Singapore, where the queer body only exists when its immediate spatial or temporal context permits. To me, this work is political to the extent that the investigation and findings are embedded within a context of power imbalance, and in surfacing these findings, the awareness surrounding our disempowered people is heightened. However, I'd like to emphasize that I did not pursue the thesis bearing a political agenda, and did not take upon political activism since the thesis is not required to call for immediate change. Instead, my work aims for academic integrity in both breadth and depth within its investigation and inferences. Thus, the connections drawn between theory and findings aim to honestly capture the states of the queer body and space within Singapore. So my presentation is organized into 3 broad sections: the investigation, their representation, and how these are translated into an architectural proposal. So in attempting to outline the queer body, I looked into the spatial practice of cruising, which involves the appropriation of public objects and spaces by queer individuals for social and sexual connection. These were some secondary material available that tracked down spaces widely known to be cruising hotspots within Singapore. However, the material I could obtain did not have the grain or scale that was needed to study cruising as a spatial phenomenon. Thus, the investigation required primary material that explicitly and specifically narrated how and which spaces were used and at which time for the purpose of cruising. In trying to capture practices that lie beyond mainstream knowledge, non-conventional archives serve as gateways into secret life worlds. In this sense, online forums help to paint an ecosystem of cruising, detailing communicative systems, cruising hotspots, and both self-encounter surveillance systems that were integral in transforming public parks into sexualized spaces. After consolidating the data from the forums and secondary material, I geographically mapped out the queer spaces throughout Singapore, denoting whether they are presently active or inactive, and whether they were formalized or informal. This is overlaid against NPark's strategy of island-wide park networks, which could be technically leveraged for cruising. The archived queer spaces were also reconfigured into a drawing that organizes them based on two axes. The closet mirror axis on this end denotes how outwardly queer they are, while the orgasm axis on this side denotes how outwardly sexual they are. The drawing aims to imagine in a grotesque manner what a queer urban configuration could look like. In noting the distant representation of sex within academic texts, researcher Gavin Brown argues for the use of ethnographic field notes that visually capture the direct experience of being both observer and observed on site, thereby revealing modes of encounter, being, and becoming that operate through these cruise spaces. Starting off with my direct observations of cruising within a park, the research became an organic process of acquiring the skills and sequence of gestures through which the cruising encounter is established. Through learning this, I could note the recurring patterns of activity attached to each feature of the park. Beyond the park, formalized and licensed queer spaces are also studied to see how informal cruising tactics are concretized within the design of queer spaces. The investigative process involved immersing myself within designated spaces of cruising, which entailed figuring out ways of transcribing spatial conditions without disrupting the present activity and endangering the users of the sites. In this case, I had to pretend that I was texting a friend while textually mapping out the interiors of a sauna that I was studying. To uncover how the design of these spaces afford cruising, I attempted to map out a network of materials and objects to see how they facilitate each stage of cruising, be it searching, contexting, or acting. Here, the exploded axonometric on this side is accompanied by a topological network of connections that establish both the sequencing and configuration of the interior spaces. These then reveal how an urban closet shields a usually linear sequence of cruising spaces that facilitate the gradual decloseting of the queer body on this end. The fragments of individual microspaces are then combined and overlaid to extract relationships between these microspaces and to communicate the most essential elements pivotal to a cruising space. Circling back to the park, a set of drawings are made to transcribe the mental processes of historical surveillance that reconfigures a cruiser's negotiation of their immediate spatial surroundings. So this representation of layers, both in the overlay as well as the gradation of spaces, evolved into a design priority within the architectural proposal. So in reflection, an underlying struggle throughout the studies was mediating two forms of legibility. On one hand, there was a need for the representation to achieve academic legibility, which involves abstracting and organizing real-life cruising practices into conventional modes of representation. On the other hand, there was a need to suppress legibility on my side to prevent the decloseting of and thereby endangering both the users and these spaces. Thus, the representation had to balance capturing vital information that clearly communicates how the same space is both attributed a function and appropriated for cruising, while omitting information that would compromise the safety of this community. Hence, representing both function and use through the visual overlay is applied throughout the Homo Sutra, which is a compilation of drawings that show how park objects and spaces are appropriated for cruising. As a bridge to the architectural proposal, these drawings are overlaid with micro-design interventions in red in this case, which accentuate and enhance pre-existing technical logics learned and practiced within cruising to be more readily appropriated by the users. Often, these drawings borrow from precedent architectural interventions to offer new possibilities of cruising, in this case, a genderless toilet designed by Interim Office of Architecture in the US. Beyond objects, the body silhouette is also transformed by embodied signals for cruising. These are highly site-specific to allow the cruiser to camouflage themselves while discreetly displaying how they wish to approach and be approached. Building upon the Homo Sutra, the micro-design interventions are collaged within larger drawings to project new design horizons while retaining the overlay as a design method. These sets of experiments were then condensed into the architectural proposal, which is less a final work of architecture than an ongoing compilation of typologies that test out how architecture could illuminate the spatial practice of cruising to the curious Singaporean within the context of a park. To further contextualize the practice of cruising within Singapore, the notion that the HDB flat is a site for producing and proliferating the heteronormative family unit sets off a study of HDB typologies across time. As a basic template, the HDB unit is then deconstructed, serving as modules to initiate the design of a cruising space in the guise of a chalet. These are recontextualized into the site, contaminating a space normatively used for productive child rearing with the transient act of cruising. The chalets are then layered along the park's topography, acting as nodes for all the searching, contacting, and acting stages for cruising. Beyond its physical makeup, I also investigated the domestic processes that make the HDB a home. I zoomed into laundry to implicate the bed sheet, since the bed is an intimate site which queer bodies have limited access to within the context of the HDB. The bed sheet forms the basis of a device that could be compacted or expanded. In immediately juxtaposing a domestic act after a sexual one, I aim to highlight the transience of queer pleasure within this context. The device also interfaces with the body, transforming the silhouette to act as a signal system that persists a tradition that is native to cruising. Lastly, the device is interfaced with architecture. I experimented with various configurations to see how they could act as shelter, signals, or shields. Hence, the device feeds back into the design of park shelters that disperse as nodes throughout the cruising fields within my architectural proposal. Drawing from these experiments with the bed sheet, the architectural proposal curates a set of devices incorporated throughout all the architectural objects distributed throughout the park. With the aid of the bed sheet, these devices are where pockets of queer space, which is transient and fleeting, is created by the users themselves. Thus, my architectural proposal formulates architecture as a network of devices that interface the cruisers' bodies with objects and buildings, providing an unwavering reflection of the transience, elusiveness, and ambiguity of queer space here within Singapore. So that's all. Thank you so much for listening. I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Thanks, Nas. That's really interesting. It's almost like a forensic investigation at times, isn't it? And very, very broad as well. You went all over the place to find your research. Yeah, I think there's plenty of questions to ask, but we'll leave it for later. So for now, we have Gabs first. Gabriel, who will present City Playbook. Gabs, please.
Okay. Hi, so I'm Gabrielle and my project title is City Playbook. So just a quick description of my project. This slide displays the contents of the City Playbook. Essentially, my thesis project offers a framework connecting stories and space by which the story of a city may be studied, modulated, and retold. It can be considered a guide to city placemaking. So it describes how to conduct a city placemaking campaign that is also modeled after traditional storytelling narrative structure. It tells you how to collect stories to form an initial diagnosis of your city, and then how and when to roll out an alternative story schemes in both the digital media space and physical space. So I tested 2 campaigns, partially in theory and partially in practice. The one you see in this slide is the Geylang campaign, in which I handle non-fiction narratives. The image of Geylang is that of danger and vice behavior, the sacrificial lamb for the safety of the rest of Singapore. Hence, the campaign wishes to overturn this image, and through the exposition of secret patterns of order, say Geylang is a safe community. In this campaign, I gathered stories of vice in the city and of migrant workers' lived realities. These stories reflect real recurring events and behavior in physical space, hence I deem them as non-fiction. So this is an overview of my second campaign conducted in Yishun. It was chosen as a contrasting campaign because it deals with the fiction narrative of Yishun as opposed to the non-fiction narratives of Geylang. In this campaign, I gathered stories of weird and wonderful happenings in the city, which contribute to the so-called crazy town image of Yishun. This is considered a fiction narrative because it is comprised of isolated events that are cherry-picked to form a sensational media image of the city. So the initial area of interest, this whole thesis got started because of my love for storytelling. As I dove into the initial research concerning stories in space, I discovered a paper about the stories told by different groups of people on Christmas Island. The paper described these stories as akin to layers of sediments in which narratives and emotions are built up in the physical space of the island. So I then scrubbed through media and research-based accounts of the island, as well as conducted online interviews with island residents that I found on Facebook. I called these accounts place narratives, and they range from politically motivated descriptions of goings-on the island to folk tales imported from Singaporean and Malaysian culture. Through this initial research, I was able to recognize the phenomenon that every city is composed of multiple narratives from a myriad of perspectives, and that these narratives are often in conflict and contrast with one another. For example, the Australian mainland might paint the island as Australia's refugee island, while the locals themselves would decry the stigma and promote themselves as a vibrant, independent community in their own right. So this moved my thesis scope into the social and political sphere, in which the question arose of which narratives of a city should be surfaced. The next major study I did that significantly influenced the thesis process was a spatial study of David Fincher's 1997 movie, The Game. So the frame showed the key turning points in the fictional narrative that is being spatially imposed over the day-to-day reality of the protagonist's life. The study of the game then deepened as I attempted to recreate the game from the perspective of the game master. So what I did was I orchestrated networks of spatial setups around the city, which were carefully designed to create opportunities for the unwitting player, a regular citizen, to reach the next key stages of the fictional narrative of the game. So these scenarios were not prescriptive of a singular outcome, but rather accounted for various playouts as well as the factor of chance, which is something that exists in reality. So in the end, what drove me to choose these local sites was the desire to conduct a real on-the-ground testing of my framework, like a naive and sincere test of let's see if this playbook works. So these two maps were the outcomes of my testing of the story collection component of my playbook. To save time, I'll mainly speak about the first site, Geylang, as the research methods and testing of the playbook are the same across both sites. So for Geylang, I signed up for the Geylang Adventures tour hosted by Chike. Although I also did a lot of online research, the Geylang Adventures tour was where I got most of my content from because physically being there and seeing some of the stories play out before my eyes made for a far stronger story. Not only are stories collected by this method more real, they are also far more detailed and interesting. I gave each story a name. One story I called The Dance of the Drug Peddlers. It's about these men who illegally peddle drugs openly by the sidewalk. So this dance then plays out very humorously as a Cisco van runs a street corner and down the road. It never stops, but it causes a succession of drug peddlers to retreat along the same well-worn path. So next, I'll describe the on-the-ground testing that I did. Taking the example of the Dance of the Drug Peddler story, I designed this table for drug peddlers as a way of revealing the story and the hidden pattern of order that it demonstrates. So I prototyped and built this table. Then I brought it down to the actual site. I recorded a video of myself setting up the table next to a drug peddler. The frames of the video are here. So I set it up and I knocked it down, and it managed to capture the attention of the people around, although the second drug peddler around the corner was not working that day, so I couldn't see if it would escape his notice or not. So after I was done with recording all this, I folded up the table and left it where the peddlers store their other equipment. So after all that, my attempt to synthesize all this research architecturally manifested in the second half of the playbook, which describes how to amplify or dispel stories in space. My full visualization of it is a master text with hundreds of spatial diagrams instructing an aspiring city maker how to diverge paths, direct vision, and implant concepts, ideas, and suggestions in space. So what you see here is just a portion of what the spatial diagram should be. These drawings describe how to plant what I call markers in space. These markers serve to amplify or dispel stories in space through influencing behavior. For example, the earlier described falling table at Geylang serves to announce the rhythm of the dance of the drug peddlers. So these drawings also describe how to diverge circulation in public paths, to direct vision or to encourage movement or interaction. Just like in the movie The Game, they create hints and opportunities for the players, who are the general public, to encounter these markers and hence observe the desired narratives playing out in real space. So in Geylang, for example, this is achieved through the strategic placement of street lamps and lanterns in alleys. When people cut through certain alleys, they might end up encountering one of the narratives that we designed for earlier. These alleys are designed for end-to-end visibility, but at the same time preserving the subtle spaces required for existing behavior to continue, such as the soliciting of street-walking prostitutes. So I see my thesis as a work in progress at the scale of communal knowledge in the field of architecture. In the same way that I hope for my thesis to be a continuation, my political stance on people and their stories is also a continuation. It hasn't wavered from start to end. The foundation of it is an understanding that each city is composed of a myriad of conflicting and contrasting narratives. I believe that each and every one of them is true and real in its own right all at the same time, even when they are directly opposing one another. I believe that architecture and space can potentially be a tool to surface narratives in a city, to give alternative narratives more leverage in the face of predominant ones. And in closing, it is my hope that my thesis may contribute to future efforts to develop an understanding of story space language to achieve this end. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. That's a really interesting and it's a really interesting presentation. I think we'd love to hear more about later as well. So for now, we have Rachel, who will present electoral politics in Singapore, helping opposition parties.
Sorry, can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. So my thesis is exactly as the title suggests, an investigation of the link between electoral politics and the way different parties use space, and thereafter finding an architectural way to help opposition parties win more votes in elections. Yeah. So what sparked the topic? So the idea that my thesis could be a study between electoral politics and space started from the general elections of 2020. I was intrigued by the Workers' Party win in Sengkang and the way that people were responding to them. On my own Facebook feed, there were people who were writing about what it meant to them. And for a lot of people, it meant a citizenry that wasn't quite as apathetic, a more robust opposition representation in parliament, and it meant more democracy. So that was what sparked my interest in electoral politics. I wanted to find out what made people vote for the opposition and whether space had anything to do with it, and if there was a possibility of helping opposition parties win in more wards. So the phenomenon that first intrigued me was the Alkan celebrations, in which many WP supporters come together at this particular coffee shop in Block 322 every time the results from the general elections are announced. So I was interested in the way this place had kind of taken on an identity that was organic, that is one not conferred by PAP, but one that had been cultivated over the years through association with these sort of spontaneous displays connected to an alternative political party. So I began mapping out what I could observe during a site visit to the coffee shop, the areas surrounding it, including how shop owners in the small businesses would sort of colonize the residents' corner with their own wares, and observe how residents would come in the area with the tree in the middle to talk shop, talk politics, and also leave their own things behind, fashioning the RC into kind of their own urban living room. And from there, I interviewed the MP of Aogang, SMC, Mr. Dennis Tan, and from the interview mapped out how this area had grown to be a key social node in Aogang, later taking on a political identity when the Meet the People started being held opposite to the coffee shop. And from the interview, I also confirmed what I learned from doing some internet research, that this phenomenon was able to happen partially because the residents in Aogang were already part of a tight-knit Teochew community to begin with. They had been resettled from the same kampong and everybody knew each other. And that spirit hadn't really changed since they were resettled. And the MP also told me that this was a culture unique to Aogang, and this wasn't really something you could replicate elsewhere, at least not within the span of 4 years to the next GE. So I started to look for more clues that I could replicate architecturally, bearing in mind that the end product had to be something, as I said, we could realistically implement in the period between GEs. So of course, in the study of the other, you need to study the dominant power. In spatial terms, you need to understand how dominant power works to maintain and keep their space, and how the other works within the confines that have been set up by the dominant power. So PAP's infrastructure is born of decades of setting up the new towns, to the community centers, to the scattering of feedback units, childcare centers, down to the public housing units 80% or more of the population lives in. And all these count as state intervention into our personal lives because they co-opt activities essential to the running of our day-to-day lives into the PAP brand. And this generates a kind of consensus among the citizenry, making it hard for any other ideology to take over that monopoly. So now I needed to document how the other traverse the space of the ruling majority. So I went to a few Meet the People sessions, but for the sake of time, I'll just show you one area. So Aogang was the first area I went to map out the movements within the void deck of Block 310 during the Meet the People session, in hopes of finding any pattern to the way they use space. So one common thing I observed was that the chairs where the public sat were arranged a lot along the periphery, while the more serious consultation areas were located further in. So this, coupled with the porosity of the void deck blocks, created like zones of mobilization, which are shaded in blue, which is where the passersby mostly stop to chat with volunteers or people who are here to consult the MP. So compared to PAP's version of guaranteed mobilization through fixed infrastructure, the Workers' Party's version was more temporal. And I also had the pleasure of listening to WP volunteers complain about how gerrymandering didn't allow them to have any kind of fixed office space. And finally, when the session ended, the chairs and tables would be kept back and everything would look the same as if there hadn't been an event the night before. So that kind of gave me the idea that the end product should also be something that appears and disappears, assembled and kept back to keep in line with the restrictions that opposition had been dealt. So after that, I scaled the exploration up and tagged along for their welfare programs. And from there, I found out that they grouped the blocks into a single SMC or a subdivision of a GRC into clusters. And the team would just rotate from clusters week to week, targeting one block within the cluster at a time and gradually just try to cover all grounds that way. For events, void decks were selected as a main medium. Otherwise, it would just be normal house visits. So through this cluster rotation, they reach out to their constituents without having an official event space, without having to apply for permits, etc. And to me, this is carried out in a similar way to the MPS, sort of appearing and disappearing, making use of the porosity of the void decks for publicity, and more importantly, just creating that image of situating themselves amongst the people. So with all that, being in Archi School, of course, the key question is how is any of this architectural, or while it may be spatial, how is any novel architectural form going to come out of this? And coming back to the purpose of my thesis, how was I to persuade people to vote for an alternative political party, particularly one that may not have many resources to leverage? So for me, it helped to distill whatever I had learned into design criteria. The product had to first embody the transience of the MPS, the welfare programs, makeshift objects that could be assembled and disassembled easily, brought out and kept away. As opposed to the PAP's fixed infrastructure, the end product had to be transient, almost guerrilla, which made me think of the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong, the rubber ducky floats that Thailand protesters employed to ward off tear gas. And perhaps the difference between these instances and the events held by opposition parties was an object that, when wielded together, could create a sort of branded imagery for the party, which we could then use to augment the impact of the current activities that WP were carrying out, and in the process, create that sort of political identity for the areas in which they were carried out. So I started exploring how everyday objects could be agglomerated, made easy to use for the masses, constructed to make favorable for social media proliferation, and made into Instagrammable or aesthetic layouts from different vantage points. Yep, so yeah, and the original sequence and locations of food drives could be kept the same, but made more aesthetic, photographed and spread via social media. And same for the MPS, the hawker center walkabouts. Small businesses could also be framed with the MPs or volunteers featured at the back. Yeah, and all these images would accumulate and create a sort of branding for the party. So to summarize, my earlier explorations later gave rise to an exploration of political imagery and branding, and how architecture and objects could possibly play into the whole conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. It's interesting how combative or how explicitly combative your project is. I mean, the premise doesn't beat around the bush at all. It just goes straight to helping the opposition. Okay, so finally, we have, at least our last student presenter will be Chike, who will present Transiency and Liminality, a coexistence approach to rethinking foreign worker dormitories in Singapore.
Hi, are you able to see my screen? Yes, okay. Hi everyone, I'm Chike, and I'm really happy to be given this opportunity to speak about my topic, which is one that I've come to care a lot about. My project is titled Transiency and Liminality, a coexistence approach to foreign worker dormitories in Singapore. And today I'll be peeling back to share more about my research process and how the conversations that I had with the locals and the migrant community shaped my design to be what it is. So why did I choose this topic? The migrant community was one that I couldn't really ignore as I grew up next to Little India. So every weekend, I would actually see the workers hanging around, enjoying their day off. And this was a very common sight for me. So through my academic journey, I also wrote papers and even did a project on fences in Little India. So for thesis, I thought, why not delve deeper? This is why when I started out my thesis, I had a series of questions. For example, where are the workers' dormitories? Why do we not see more workers around when they make up such a significant population? I started out mapping what was happening geographically, and I came to realize that many of the worker dormitories and even their recreation centers were deliberately situated in far-flung locations away from residential areas, as if to delineate certain boundaries where the workers should keep their activities to. So I also asked myself, how did we actually get into this situation? Do we need so many workers? Actually, in Singapore, even in the 1990s, there has been talks about reducing foreign labor. I wouldn't really dwell much on the detail today because it's a huge topic for discussion. But the fact is that these workers are very integral to our country's development, given our own limited manpower. Reducing reliance on them would not happen so easily or quickly. I wanted to approach this foreign worker conundrum by exploring the notion of assimilating them into our society to slowly move away from the constant turnover of cheap and low-skilled workers and to retain the manpower that we actually need for our growth. So in terms of architecture, this translates into how can I look at this in terms of the idea of assimilation and coexistence to counter the current system. With that, I was eager to conduct a survey with local residents to see how receptive they will be to having migrant workers stay in their midst. And it just so happened that during the pandemic last year, many vacant state properties within neighborhoods were converted into dormitories. So I took this opportunity to interview some residents at two of the sites, which is Tampines and Redhill. Okay, actually the responses were a lot more uplifting than I expected. Of course, there's a fair share of negative stereotypes though. And just to illustrate some residents talk about how if we were to give the workers too much freedom, they will start to forget rules and this will become like a Little India, like as if it was a bad thing. And how the workers should be moved to somewhere rural instead. But all of these stereotypes were really unfounded because during the pandemic last year, where the workers were staying in this compound, they were not even allowed out. So there was actually no interaction between the locals and foreign workers to begin with for them to perceive the workers so negatively. On the other hand, however, there were a handful of the public that were actually more understanding and sympathetic, who sees the workers as humans too and not here to create trouble. So I thought perhaps the transiency of the situation does help the local community in being more tolerant and welcoming towards the workers' presence in their neighborhood, even if it's just a percentage of them. There were also legitimate concerns that the residents raised up about the potential of overcrowded neighborhood amenities and vehicular noise pollution and overlooking into unsightly spaces if the workers were to stay permanently, which inspired me to conceive the entire endeavor as a design challenge instead. So having spoke to the locals, I also wanted to gain a better understanding of the migrant community. So I started collecting stories through articles, videos, interviews, and books, etc., to try and string them along into this series of illustration to give the tutors at my quick panel a better glimpse into the workers' lives. And way beyond that, I also started volunteering with the two NGOs last year, one known as Welcome Iman Backyard Wimby, another one which is the COVID Migrant Support Coalition. As I was really halfway through my thesis, I just wanted to stay involved in this NGOs to stay connected to the migrant community that I was designing for, because it's very hard to design for a community that I do not understand much about without stepping into their shoes. So in terms of design translation, what I actually struggled with a lot was trying to justify the construction of the dormitory within neighborhoods. And because given that they are all prime land area. So initially, I wanted to pair the dormitory up with another public program to justify its opportunity cost. But that in itself seems to contradict the very idea that the dormitory deserves to be integrated into the neighborhood itself. So eventually, I thought, why not just use any vacant land available within the neighborhood, even if they're only for 5 to 10 years and will be needed for future developments next time. This led me to conceive the idea of a dormitory not as a permanent structure, but one that can perhaps be disassembled and reconfigured onto new sites when their current plot is needed for development. And I also thought that this sits well with the idea of transiency that I mentioned earlier, that perhaps the concept of transiency itself has the potential to bring about greater tolerance and acceptance from the local community. So with the scenario set up, I had to next look into how to design the spaces, the borders between the local and migrant spaces. I originally wanted to study two of the foreign worker recreation centers that were open to the public. These were centers that had recreation facilities like the futsal court, basketball court, eating houses that were frequented by locals and foreign workers. And they were the perfect scenario to study behavioral patterns and interactions between two groups inhabiting the same space. Unfortunately, all of these organic interactions ceased along with the pandemic, and I, as a local, was not even welcome into the recreation center anymore. So instead, without real-life scenarios to base off of, I have to draw from theoretical ideas and explore in a very architectural way, like using form to design and to mediate borders, to come up with hypothetical programs that would enable different levels of engagement between the local and migrant community. So I think it's now looking back after we've done our thesis and having this conversation, I come to realize that I've taken for granted many of these interactions and tensions that were happening all around us between the local and migrant community for my case before the pandemic. And should circumstances have been more accommodating, I think my thesis would have probably taken quite a different approach and to capture more of the real life intricacies. Also, I also think that for anyone doing a topic like mine that focuses on a marginalized group, you will be confronted by the disparities between what you're trying to propose, as well as the lived realities of the groups that you're studying when you go down and speak to them. So for me, the disparity came from wanting to propose a thesis solution for the worker dormitories on a national scale that would allow for the scenario of locals and migrant workers to coexist together. Versus on the other hand, when I was volunteering, a lot of what we were doing to bridge the gaps between the local community and migrant community were actually not even the architectural interventions. They were through like media campaigns, social media, organizing outreach activities. So this just kind of made me wonder what's beyond architecture in a way also, and the limitations of architecture approach. Yeah. So that's all for me.
Thank you very much for that. Quite self-reflective, especially right at the end, that reflection on the thesis process and with the limitations of the project and the architectural thesis as a whole. So, finally, we'd like to hear from Mariana, who will be talking very briefly about Edit Collective as well. So Edit Collective is a group of women working collectively to challenge the enduring biases and hierarchies embedded in the built environment. So the Feminist Design Collective believes in full social, economic, and political equality for all, and uses design as a tool to support more egalitarian interactions, both during the design process as an outcome of the finished project. So Mariana, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for all your project presentations. They were extremely interesting. So I'm really looking forward to discussing them more. Thank you so much to Dr. Lilian Chee for inviting me to this event. I'm going to speak briefly about the work of Edit. So as it was already introduced, we are a feminist design collective based in London, and most of us met at university where we shared common interests, and this led us to forming the collective a couple of years ago in 2018. So we have been asked in the past why we describe ourselves as a feminist design collective. And by this, we don't mean that we just happen to be a collective of feminists, which as individuals we all are, but this description refers to the way we practice. As a feminist design collective, the approach we take to any project uses design as a tool to support more equal interactions, both during the design process and as an outcome of the finished project. And we follow the same ethos when working within EDIT. We want EDIT to be managed in the most egalitarian way possible, where no voice is less important than another. Our decisions are taken collectively, our work is critiqued by all members, and no one holds ownership or authorship of the work individually. Collaborating collectively in this way has actually required us to do some really hard work around unlearning the individualized habits of ownership and authorship, which mainstream architectural education and practice quite strongly embed. Our ambition is to bring a feminist lens to the final output, but also to the process of our projects. We aim to make our work super accessible, so it can be enjoyed by a wide audience from varied backgrounds. We have found that using methods which move away from traditional architecture and its conventional outputs opens up the conversation in a more inclusive way. Our main goal is to provoke a process of unlearning some very deeply ingrained and serious issues through playful and engaging interactions. So this was also the case for the first project we developed together called Act 1, Honey, I'm Home, where we took a space everyone is familiar with, the home, and domestic objects in order to examine and challenge the performances they were designed for. So the project understands our interactions at the scale of the city, the home, the room, and the object as a performance and as theatrical sets which have been written and designed under systems of patriarchy. The research started by interrogating the floor plan of Victorian houses. We argue that floor plan of such a house can be read as a diagram of familial and gendered power relations through the simple demarcation of space, where back of house was private and feminine, and front of house was public and masculine. Performativity is present in our work as a topic of research, but also as a process through which we explore different topics. We feel that design has become so powerfully normalized that our actions within the spaces have become prescribed performances. This is further ingrained into society through popular media showing most spaces, as well as roles and relationships between people as unquestioned standards. So in this image from Britain's first space standards, the day of a heteronormative nuclear family is very well planned out. So the father goes to work and the mother looks after the children at home. The mother is scheduled to serve dinner to her family, but she herself is not scheduled to eat at all. The power dynamics in an example nuclear family is clearly established. In an opposition to prescribed standards and performances, in Honey, I'm Home, we'd like to invite people to imagine alternative modes of living. So this research project took the shape of an object for our submission to the 2019 Oslo Architecture Triennale. We decided to focus on housework and to showcase an object linked to a specific domestic performance. The Triennale, titled Enough, invited designers to rethink and resist our current cultural obsession with economic growth, which has landed us in a time of climate emergency and social division. As one of our most naturalized models of living together, we felt that the nuclear family and its home act as a really good starting point when daydreaming about themes like degrowth. For our project in the Triennale, we made some simple alterations to a recognizable appliance to challenge current divisions of housework established by the nuclear family. The gross domestic product, which is a play on the term GDP, is a hoover that can only be operated when used by 3 people simultaneously. By altering the hoover's design to make its individual use almost impossible, we wanted to challenge the current notions of domestic labor and explore its potential to be a collective, sociable, and political act. In a world where time is money, saying no to productivity as the most important measure becomes an act of resistance. So GDP, or the gross domestic product, is an alternative to the capitalist assumption that housework is most efficient when performed individually. In order to make the GDP, we broke apart and modified several used vacuum cleaners, rewired them, and repainted them, testing out many different colors along the way. It was important for us not to position the project in a way which poses it as a solution for a better way of living, but instead to invite people to challenge the way they are living now and open up questions. Why something has been designed the way it has, who has designed it, and who have they designed it to be used by? Could it have been designed differently? And if so, how would it impact us in a wider way? A continuation of the theme of scripts and performances, Act 3, a woman of color enters the workplace, Scene 1, overheard in the office/oppression, is a fictional narrative based on true accounts from numerous peers of color, highlighting the experiences of women of color within the architectural office. The piece makes clear the very much still present racial biases and injustices within the profession via a reality-based fiction to allow the reader to identify with the experiences of the protagonist of the scene. This text and drawing is included in Now You Know, a publication that brings together a collection of 50 reflections from architects and urbanists of color, addressing spatial inequality and discrimination in the built environment industry. The woman of color enters the workplace, and the pictured article about public toilets, titled Just Toilets, explore our understanding of intersectionality in the built environment, whether it's in the home, the workplace, or in a public space. The subject of public toilets is a useful lens through which issues around access and inclusion can be observed and magnified. Throughout history and up until this day, various marginalized groups were denied access to public conveniences on the basis of their gender, race, or disability. Even though the size and design of toilets have been regulated for quite some time, the never-ending queues to ladies' rooms and the plight of transgender people show that truly just and inclusive toilets have not yet been achieved. So in this piece, we argue that better toilets for women and the marginalized mean better cities for everyone. Members of EDIT have previously researched also the role of cultural institutions within the city and their potential for becoming public spaces of positive influence. So we were really happy to be appointed by the Barbican Centre in London to design and build the exhibition How We Live Now, which opened in May earlier this year. The exhibition displays the work of Matrix Feminist Design Cooperative. Matrix was active in the 80s and 90s in the UK, and their work addressed the ways in which the design of the built environment excludes particular groups, specifically in relation to gender, race, and disability. We were lucky to work alongside curators John Asbury from the Barbican and Joss Boyce from the Matrix Cooperative to develop the concept for the exhibition. The installation we designed explores two important social questions. Who are our buildings and shared spaces for, and how do they affect us? The brief was to create something different than a conventional architecture exhibition, which would focus only on the few final refined pieces held up as precious artifacts. It was important for everyone that the behind the scenes process work, ranging from construction details to emails, was treated as equally important, if not more, as the final drawings, photos, and models. This is to emphasize the collaborative nature of architectural practice, which often gets obscured by the lone genius myth. To contrast that notion, we were keen to work in a non-hierarchical way and involve others to generate an exciting collaboration between different disciplines. So we brought together some incredible designers and fabricators to help us realize the project. This also echoes Matrix approach, who were particularly radical in their time due to their interdisciplinary and intersectional approach. The timber and metalwork was fabricated by fabricator and artist Eloise Farley of Ladywood. And we also worked with her to build the exhibition structure, as you can see in some of the images. The textiles were designed and made by artist gardener Rachel Jones and fashion designer Hannah Coley. Their driving concept was to naturally dye the textiles using a site-specific palette based on plants which can be found in the area around the Barbican Center. The biggest challenge for us was how to create an intimate space within the vast open space of the Barbican foyer. We feel we designed the exhibition to be also coherent with its context. The ground level of the Barbican Center is an important civic space, and it's used in a variety of different ways by people, as a study room, as a place to hang out, to read, as waiting lobby for the many events that happen in the center, and as a bar. We wanted the exhibition to feel unpretentious and approachable, to complement rather than detach itself from the atmosphere of the ground floor of the Barbican. We approached this by taking inspiration from how political and community groups often informally appropriate domestic space, to meet in someone's living room or gather around the kitchen table. And we also reversed it by creating something that feels domestic within the larger institutional context. We created a space that feels domestic whilst also subtly undermining it, which we feel works well alongside Matrix work. And to do that, we made 3 key moves. First of all, scale. We started by enclosing a small space within the larger Barbican setting, and then smaller spaces inside that again. This creates a more intimate and comfortable space made up of domestically proportioned nooks and rooms. Secondly, the walls. Matrix sought to make architecture accessible to those without a formal architectural education. For example, a whole chapter of their book, Making Space, is dedicated to how to read plans. So we wanted to reflect this honest approach in the construction of the exhibition, and created walls to house and exhibit the work, and they're made out of timber stud work. And this material references the construction technique typically used to create internal partitions in houses. We wanted to reveal what happens if you take off the plasterboard and look inside. These structures are then punctured by openings mimicking doors and windows. Then finally, in one continuous loop, is a metal curtain rail which weaves in and out of the walls, much like pipes might, with a curtain wrapping and enclosing individual spaces. The curtain instantly brings connotations of domesticity and privacy, but it is also key in allowing the audience to interact with the design of the space. By moving the curtain around, you can open up or enclose spaces to create different levels of intimacy. Books and drawings can be revealed by drawing the curtain back and having a closer look. And we appreciate the professional pictures that were taken of the exhibition, but we're especially fond of observing those kind of little everyday moments of people using the space, as in the images here. And as well as the exhibition, we were also commissioned to develop a graphic identity for the exhibition itself, and a pack of at-home resources, which form an alternative form of exhibition catalog. Rather than focusing on Matrix alone, the pack showcases the work of different contemporary organizations. And the work of these collectives and groups highlights voices that are often marginalized in architecture and design. The pack also includes reinterpreted materials from the Matrix archive. The exhibition catalog, which is called Revealing Objects, was conceptualized as an alternative mode of dissemination of the archive presented in the exhibition. It was designed as a series of objects which vary in size and context, but all follow a similar graphic identity. So we had contributions from After Party, Decosm, Disordinary Architecture, Manual Labors, Part W, and ourselves. And Revealing Objects is a collection of essays, posters, activities, and maps. Each object can be read and used to consider architecture and urbanism's role in reinforcing inequalities, gender roles, and colonial legacies, and the effect this has on whether we feel welcome or ignored, at home or out of place. And I'm going to jump to our current project, which is work in progress. And it's a short film commission from Maxi Museum in Rome, which responds to the theme of gender and space. And we took as a starting point our research into laundry and its intersections with gender and class. So these two images were taken from our Home magazine, which was a publication distributed to HDB residents in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And what's interesting about them is the spatial character of laundry, which is almost a facade feature in high-rise HDB buildings, like in the image on the left, but also the gendered character of domestic work. So here you can see the washing machine is called your HDB washerwoman. And also the educational tone of the page on the right, where laundry is a contentious issue as it exists in the liminal space between the private and the public. And in the UK, as well as in many other Western countries today, drying of laundry in gardens and on balconies is banned by lease covenants, landlords, or management companies. In this note in the bottom right corner here, an angry neighbor reprimands a resident who hangs some laundry on their balcony. The note says, "No washing on balconies. This is not a council estate." The notion that reproductive work is a private affair of the nuclear family contributed to the narrative that defines care work as unimportant and best concealed. In addition, and by extension, the sight of laundry drying outside is often negatively associated with the working classes, and in the UK, council estates, which is our public housing. So this is just a still from our movie. And in the film, taking laundry outside is a demonstration against the culture that values productive work over reproductive work, and against the puritanical and classist assumption that signs of occupation are not welcome in our built environment. So the washing line becomes a way to appropriate public space in what we call this laundry protest or laundry performance. And this is it from me today. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Mariana. I think it's really interesting parallels and contrast between the student works and your collective's work as a full-fledged design practice. And also, there are very interesting parallels, I think, also with Dr. Lilian Chee's research into domesticity and politics of space. So we'll get into that after the break. We'll have a break of 3 minutes. And we also screen Naz's short film in the meantime on YouTube while we all get water and prepare for the discussion afterwards. So we see you all at 5 o'clock, 5:01 Singapore time. All right. So thanks everyone and stay tuned.
Hi, I'm Z.
You can see I'm a regular here at the fields.
In the day, it's just a typical family park. The lookout towers are a favorite for the kids, and I guess their mom and dad too. But come sunset, these buildings are favorites amongst a different crowd. Once the families disperse, they come here to connect with those like them.
And like all good Singaporeans, they've managed to organize themselves into 2 different groups, carriers and walkers.
If you're a carrier, you typically start your night at the toilets. The layering of exposed cubicles and showers already make the toilets cruisy enough. And the sight of men or women changing in such an exposed place is enough to make even the most closeted amongst us quiver. But if you're a more committed cruiser like me, you can go up to the laundry level and get a bed sheet, which is essentially a key to the chalets. It all sounds a little weird now, but you'll see how this place transforms into a cruising heaven soon enough. And yes, it's open to everyone. Some cruisers prefer to walk the fields, because it's free, or for the freedom I guess. But if you're an older working professional like me, you'd rather have a room of your own and bed a walker in. And it seems I found my target. Time for the catch. I seem to have lost the boy, so I guess I'll just start with T2. It's the second tower as we get deeper into the fields, right smack in the middle of a running track. Because that's what cruising is, a game of show and seek. He's nowhere to be seen, so I suppose I'll head over to the next tower, T3. She's a darling amongst cruisers, because she sways with the wind, just like the casuarina trees around her. In my own experience, the swing helps me lose those creeps that I'm not interested in, or get physical with those I am, like him. Gotcha. He was on his way to the next tower, T4. This is the deepest one we have here in the fields, and for the most adventurous amongst us.
Somehow, the bamboo sticks sticking out from the tower are perfect for the carriers to display their bed sheets. We all could use a little self-advertising, and I guess mine paid off.
He looked back, and he got the signal. After bringing him back, we did what all men like us wanted to do with each other.
We'll just wait another minute for Gabriel to come back, and we'll start. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So before we start, we'd just like to restate that this is meant to be an open discussion, right? So we'd like to encourage the student and the guests to just jump in and ask questions to each other, or just make comments, and all in all, just have a good conversation. So, if we have time as well, we'll take questions from the floor,
The body has protested
from YouTube too. So just to kick it off, we'd like to direct a question to both Mariana and to Lilian, to Prof. Lilian, about the position of architecture itself, essentially. Because so many architects and designers are optimistic about the discipline's ability to make a difference, even though the practice is so closely tied to like capital law, conventions of law, and often they propagate problematic outcomes themselves, as Mariana's presentation made quite clear. So what we want to ask is, what power does architecture really have to invoke change? And what are the discipline's limitations in this sense? And in contrast, what is the power of architectural thinking or training, and are they the same as architecture?
Do you want to go first, Mariana?
I will try. It's a really important and difficult question, I think. And architecture always, well, not always, but often architecture sort of pushes against the disciplinary boundaries, as so many of your projects do. And I think it's important to, at the same time, be ambitious about the change we want to enact in our political stances, but at the same time to be aware of those limitations of the discipline. So of course, some of the changes we as EDIT want to campaign for through our work, they're not really, we don't propose design or sort of technological solutions, because we are aware that the change needs to come from policy or from wider culture. So that's why we kind of propose these humble interventions, which are used to, we want to use to open up discussions. And I think some of your projects are really successful. And your second part of the question about, is architectural education the same as architectural practice? And I would say in this instance, no. And I think what your projects really brilliantly do is they kind of take advantage of the educational context that you're in to open up these really important conversations and to establish your stance. And yeah, I think we all know that it's not possible in exactly the same way in architectural practice. But it's important to sort of establish your position now and to try and enact these values as much as possible when you go into practice.
Okay, so maybe I'll just add, I had made some notes when you were all presenting. So actually Yongchen's question is overlapping with some of the questions I wanted to ask all of you. But I also made some observations, okay? So we have today 4 graduates. I would like to congratulate all of you, Nas, Gabrielle, Rachel, and Chike, that you took on actually difficult, I would say very prickly issues, difficult issues to discuss, and difficult if we equate architecture to an object, primarily making a building. Okay? It becomes very difficult, like how do you translate those issues, and then what you get is a building, which I think that's what Mariana just said. If we conflate everything and we think that architecture in the end needs to become a building specifically, then some issues we can't touch, because generally not every issue translates into a building. So that becomes very difficult, right? So if you limit yourself to a consideration that your outcome needs to end at that point, then you cut out a whole range of issues which you cannot touch, because generally to make a building, there are other issues and other concerns that will be equally important. And these other concerns that you're looking at might be peripheral to the building. So we have to be quite clear what is the outcome that you want to arrive at, right? Because the head and the tail are not naturally strung together in the center just by will, that you say, because I'm in an architecture school, I want to look at these issues and I will get them building. So I don't think that is correct, just to put that case. When the 4 of you presented, you're coming from a similar context, and I would say that it's useful to see Mariana's work because she's coming from a different context. And I guess the definition of what an architectural education is, what architecture can or cannot do, is probably a lot broader, more contested, and more debated. Like, how many of you would be comfortable? Would you be saying that I'm only doing small interventions? Am I doing art projects? Is this architecture? Should I be doing building? And maybe all these things will cross your mind, okay? Because you expect having done 5 years of study, that you should go out and be commissioned to do a building. If you are doing an exhibition design, can the exhibition design be political? And we can also talk about the question of politics in a little while, okay? Because I think that the question of politics here is very, your understanding of politics and Mariana's might be very, very different. The question of politics here equates too narrowly to government, at least in the context of Singapore. But over in Europe, the question of politics may not actually even, may or may not involve government. It involves a position that is lived. You live that position, okay? You believe in it, you will fight for it, and you will die for it. That's politics. So I think that it's very, very difficult. Probably it's very difficult to say, oh, we're exactly at the same plane. We are not, because culturally we're very, very different. And that has to be understood when you look across the projects. So I actually wanted to bring out 3 questions on disciplinary limits and what is the power of the thesis. What's the power of the thesis to be able to go beyond you saying, this is my preoccupation, I'm very interested in this, I want to push this, right? And often we can be saying we want to push this, but nobody's listening. So what is your potential and the power to move this thing beyond where, your thesis has ended, right? And beyond this presentation and beyond this, where does it go? Because I think, as all of you have said, these are things that are important to you, but they need to become important to other people in order to become an issue that is viably discussed in a way that has mileage, that is beyond somebody's preoccupation or it is idiosyncratic to 3 or 10 or 100 people, right? That it has to become an issue. And then that is politicized because it means something to someone and means something to a shared collective. For the disciplinary limits now, the difficulty that the 4 of you undertook is to make tangible what is transient, okay? And not just what is transient, what is actually not possible to map perhaps in our cultural context for various kinds of cultural, social, economic taboos that are there. Okay? Whether it's political parties, whether it's sexual inclinations, whether it's vice, and what was okay, so that's probably social issues like the foreign workers, okay, which has become very big, and it's most of these questions are like elephants in the room. Okay, they are there, but we don't have the vocabulary to talk about them beyond a black and white. Like I agree or I disagree. Actually, that's whether you agree or disagree. There's actually a whole bunch of things that we can talk about beyond just giving our opinions. Okay, and if anything that your project could do is to allow these various shades to be talked about, so that it's not just yes or no. So there's a difficulty that you undertook to make tangible through architecture, through your projects, through the interventions that you made, through the drawings that you made, the films that you made, the interventions, the live performances that you had, like making the table or make these things to allow a way to talk about these things. That was not just it's right or it's wrong, it's black or it's white, this should be there or this should not be there. Okay, so you tried to create a vocabulary and a language or means to talk about these things that perhaps we had no way to talk about them. And in some ways, you also found it very difficult to collect material because how would you categorize this material, right? What is the way to make this material readable to someone else? And it's very important, I think, with Matrix, the group that I'm not sure whether you're all familiar with this, but Matrix was a very important group in the United Kingdom. And they were the first to think about, it was an all-women collective, and was the first to think about what can an alternative future or what can an alternative practice of architecture be? You know, obviously they were women, and they had different individual needs or individual demands made of them, right? So they would ask these things. And I think that actually it's for certain groups and marginalized groups, because you are not dominant, you would feel this thing because you're living it. It is politicized. It is in the everyday that you move around, that you will feel these issues. Okay, and I do think it's admirable that some of you have gone to look for things like, for example, the foreign workers, because it is very, very hard to empathize with a group that you don't know. Okay, and often we read it and we say, okay, we acknowledge that it's difficult, but how do we understand it? Understanding and acknowledging are two very different things, right? So the Matrix said, we want to make architecture accessible, but we also want to make architecture so that it is not just for architects. It's not just for us. We want people to be able to read plans and teach people how to read drawings. I mean, that is actually a very basic thing, right? You put drawings up, nobody knows how to read them. You know why people move towards models? Because they can see they're little toys. But architectural drawings, you be as good as putting contracts up or science formulas. And then people will just look at them and say, I don't know what they are, but they must belong to that discipline. So it is also making architecture accessible, right? And I guess in trying to research and put your information together, you were trying to also make not just these issues accessible to architecture, but the issues also accessible to other people. How do you make these facts that you were gathering? How do you group them? How do you tell a story? And in every single one, the idea of the narrative was very important. Also, narrative has got very bad flags, rightly or wrongly. Recently, I think also in Singapore, in our school, because it seemed to be digressing, frivolous, and navel-gazing. But perhaps narrative is the only way to talk about something and to be able to project when there is no factual base, right? Because you have no historical base to talk about it. There's no reference point that you can talk about it in a more dialectical way, or to have a kind of polemics that's not following what is there. So perhaps the narrative is the only way to do it, right? So I'm saying that you all raise many, many methods. Perhaps it's also in doing it that you had to resort to this. And there were some commonalities between the way each of you worked because of the obscurity and the difficulty of your subject matter. Because you couldn't just go there and say, let's have the material and let's go for it. Because it was not there. You had to construct it, right? You had to construct the context. You had to construct the way to tell the context. And you had to construct the way to express it such that people could read what you were saying. Okay? So there is a disciplinary limit here, because architecture tends to, if we talk about architecture, is only to make the building, tends to see all these things as making it very difficult, right? You don't get to it. It makes it very difficult to get to the building. Because after you've thought all about this, maybe in building is not the best thing to do, right? You end up and say, hey, actually, after I got all this, as Mariana said, it's actually policy which you need to affect. So it comes back to my point that these projects need to go beyond where it is now for it to matter. So you need to find, and I think that actually Edit Collective is very interesting, because probably people came together, and you need probably to work as a collective in order to have, and you need to find more voices, in order to have that kind of density and impact to say something. And also because you get tired, right? If you're doing it alone, like after a while you get tired, because you have to find funding, you have to talk to people, you have to talk to each other, and you have to have that kind of support. So architecture's limit it's very difficult, as Yongchen said, because there's capital, and you have to deal with it. And all of us need to survive, right? We need to find our jobs. We need to ask Mariana what is her job besides doing Edit Collective. Is Edit Collective your job? I mean, you get a big project like that at the Barbican, and you get a commission to design the structure and to design the collaterals. But I don't know whether that's her job. Maybe we can ask her that. Of course, it says what is architecture's role, right? Is architecture's role to be able to say these other things, or is architecture's role to make you all make buildings? Okay, what is more real? I mean, there's this question as well, right? I know that a lot of, in your group, there are a lot of you who are actually going out to find work, and you're looking at each other's pay, the starting pay, and thinking like, oh my God, is this it? So the question is, what's your purpose? Right? What's architecture's purpose, and what is your purpose, and what's the purpose of your thesis? Beyond, obviously, you're all graduated and it's done, and you passed well, and your drawings are lauded and so on. But what's the purpose? What's the purpose of this thing? If the purpose is to galvanize a conversation, then whatever each of you do must go beyond this point. Okay? There's a question of solutions versus propositional and potentiality. And if you produce solutions, means it can be used, right? And architecture is very fond of producing solutions. But can architecture be propositional? Meaning that it shows a whole array of possible solutions and possible issues. And it shows a possible future, right? It's possible trajectory. So it really comes down to the question, we seem to be coming down to the same question of what is architecture's boundaries? What is architecture's role? And to have any kind of, to understand what is architecture's potential and its power depends on your politics, depends on where you're standing, depends on the kinds of lives and futures that you see yourself going towards and leading. And I guess for each of you in 20 years' time, you will lead a kind of practice. And this question is relevant because what kind of practice will you lead? Okay, so that's my very long question. Oh, I had one more thing which I thought was interesting. Someone mentioned aesthetics. Oh, I think it was Rachel. She mentioned aesthetics, and I thought aesthetics is a camouflage. Well, you didn't say camouflage. I used the thing camouflage. Aesthetics as political imagery. You said that. But aesthetics is our camouflage, isn't it? It's our way of making things. And Mariana said that they engage certain issues in a playful and engaging way, right? That is architecture the serious thing? And then aesthetics is not very serious. And aesthetics, if we are saying that we are just doing by aesthetics, we can get away with it. I know you're also skirting the issues in perhaps the one with the political party one is probably the most dangerous one. Okay, you're skirting this in a very dangerous way, and you're also trying to find a way that you can talk without being stopped. Right. Yeah. So is architecture a way of also letting you find the devices and the means to be able to continue conducting these conversations? Because if it's about solutions, then there's one way to do it, and that's the end, right? But if it's about opening up possible ways of looking at the issues and looking at the problem and finding several solutions, finding several contexts, then I think that we have a different definition of what is a thesis and different definition of what is politics. Okay, so that's my very long answer to your question, Wong Chuen.
That was a lot to unpack, and I think it was also a question directed at our student presenters, correct? So we also like to hear very much on what Mariana would like to say, because you raised the point that context is so important, right? And the context in Singapore, what we think of as politics is so different. And how she may read these projects from a perspective of someone who's trained and is working in the UK is so different as well. So, but before we get to that, the student presenters, you want to respond? Is there anything you'd like to respond to Prof. Lilian's train of thought and her questions?
Yeah, I think I'll just respond to Prof. Lilian's first part, because I also did say something about wanting my teaching process to be ongoing, right? So for me, so firstly, what I think is that firstly, if I had the opportunity to take it further in the future, so what I would want to do is I would want to collaborate with others, or like if others took up similar research topics to contribute to this pool of knowledge of story-space language that could be used to further what I believe in my thesis, that every story that is told in a city is true at the same time, even although they are composed of conflicting and contrasting narratives. And secondly, because my thesis is kind of centered on this, you could call it placemaking. Placemaking, I did interview like some people from URA in the process of thesis. So from what I understand, the notion of placemaking in Singapore right now, there's kind of like an inter-organizational task force for it, kind of, in which they implement strategies in like CBD and all that kind of thing. And my research into other countries, then my knowledge is that they also consider it like inter-organizational skills. So it stands at the intersection of a lot of disciplines, and nobody's actually been taking it up as like making a rules for it, or there isn't like one person who's in charge of it. Like, can't just be urban planners, it can't just be architects, it can't just be workers. Like, people have to come together. So I believe that for my thesis to be ongoing, I think that there's a place for it in the real world, that doesn't just involve planners, but also the social groups involved. And thirdly, regarding accessibility, I think the final outcome that I would want my playbook to be rolled out as is as something that is readable not just by qualified people, but also the general public. So even if you don't have the full agency to enact change on a citywide or nationwide scale, there exists this public knowledge that there is this network of overlapping, conflicting, contrasting stories in space from various groups. So this is how I would envision that I would continue my work further.
It definitely seems like platforming, like how do you platform your work after it's so-called, it's not concluded, but it's reached a certain stage? It seems it's such a major thing in all these projects, right? Like, whether it's through writing, through exhibitions, or where do you just take the thing, right? I think maybe as thesis students, we think that the thesis ends when it ends, but the power of the project still can continue somehow, right? Anyway, so the other students, do you like to chip in and make a comment as well?
I think I would like to just comment about like the role of the architecture sparking conversations. Personally, I feel like although I see what I was doing volunteering with the NGOs and my architecture propositions to be quite disconnected, but at the end, during the presentation for thesis final presentation, I felt like I managed to kind of convince my crit panels. A lot of them were actually there in the first semester, and they were not buying the idea of having a dormitory within the neighborhood in itself. So towards the end, when I managed to propose this and got them talking about, oh, if we were to design it, or how should it be, could there be other forms? I thought that was like a personal win in itself, that, oh, I managed to convince them, and now they're actually talking about how can we do it better, in a way. And I think other than that, beyond the role of a thesis and stuff, for me, because I really wanted to continue working on this cause with the foreign worker and getting to the local community to be more aware of them, I'm still continuing with WIMBY, and we are now actually trying to organize activities with the workers in their dormitories to bring in locals to participate in like art jamming sessions. So it has to start off from a very small place to create these opportunities for the two groups to even be more familiar with each other first, I feel, for the bond to foster before we can jump into like bigger topics like architecture in real life. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think just to segue off, actually, I think Belle, you have a question you'd like to raise, right?
Yeah, so okay, this question is actually from YouTube. So Chan Hao mentions, so he says, "Hi Mariana, loved your presentation and work at Edit Collective. I would like to offer some pushback. Surely architecture cannot just be advocacy. So when policies change, someone has to play the role of practicing architect and manifest political ideas into buildings." And he says that if design as advocacy becomes the immediate reaction, aka we all run away from practice, I wonder who is left during the translation into built form.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, we Edit is not doing buildings mainly because we're a very young group and we're kind of operating on the fringes of the industry, I would say. So we operate in the field that we feel we can express ourselves at the moment. And for us, it's advocacy at the moment. But we do, I think most of us have ambitions to make buildings. And I mean, Matrix built buildings as well as doing advocacy, and they kind of live their values through the way they design those buildings, through the way they work with communities. So for example, there's this building called Jagonary Educational Resource Centre in East London. And that building was developed with a largely Bangladeshi community of women. And just this conversation just reminded me a little bit about that project because it arose in a very contested context as well. So the users of the building were often victims of racial abuse. So the architects wanted to express some of the cultural identity in the architectural language. So they proposed some Islamic motifs in the building, but then the users pushed back because they were worried that would sort of attract attention to their identity and would expose them to more racial abuse. And then in the end, I think there was a compromise, and the architects were able to work with the local community and to build up this sense of civic pride. And finally, in the end, there are metal grills in the windows, which kind of provide this security and safety, but they also reference some Islamic motifs. So that's how it kind of came together. But if the question and the pushback is architects cannot just advocate, then I would absolutely agree with you, and I hope that there will be space in the future for us to try and design an actual building. I would love that.
Thank you, Mariana. I think that would be pretty lovely to actually see what Edit Collective can produce in the built environment. Yeah. So I think Rachel has a comment.
Yeah, I think I'll just touch on why I decided to use aesthetics in the first place. I think from my research from when I visited the MPS, when I tagged along for welfare programs, I found that there was definitely a way that WP was using space. The opposition parties were using space, going the void decks, going on house visits, how they chose to photograph their activities. But I think for the longest time, I couldn't really see any novel architectural form, building or object coming out from the research that I did, because in a sense, these activities aren't really attached to any political, attached to any architectural identity. There were makeshift chairs or makeshift tables, but there wasn't an explicit architectural language. And I think you're right, as in Prof. Lilian is right in saying that my eventual outcome is kind of a camouflage and is kind of a language, also to circumvent restrictions and with considerations of legality, how opposition is allowed to use their space. Yeah, so if coming back to why I decided to use aesthetics, if there was a novel form, it had to come externally and then kind of be associated with their activities. Like when I say, when I talk about the Hong Kong protesters, with the way they use umbrellas, the way Thailand protesters use the rubber ducky floats, there's always that sense of whimsy that you get in all these types of images that are eventually proliferated. And these are the types of images that end up being proliferated. And then I think in this era of meme culture that we live in, this played like a big role in helping me make the decision on using aesthetics. Yeah, so.
That's really interesting. So it's a really strategic decision from the outset to as Prof. Lilian said, to brand your project.
Yeah, and also considering Instagram, TikTok, and all these platforms that are now being used to proliferate political imagery. Yeah. Basically making, how do you make people believe something? And how do you make people buy into something? Yeah.
It's an interesting reflection on what architecture can do, what architecture trading again, isn't it? It's like selling an idea rather than necessarily the building as such. Anyway, we'd like to ask Naz as well, because he hasn't had a chance to speak. Yeah.
Can I add on to what Rachel has said?
Yeah, of course.
Previously about aesthetics. Yeah, because, and I'd like to sort of address Prof. Lilian's question about whether, okay, so I guess I'll just frame it as an architectural thesis. So whether we should propose a solution or instead a proposal or a potential, right? Yeah, so I think it really depends on the issue at hand, because I think whenever I go for crit panels and I present my studies of the spaces and, for example, cruising, even the more formalized spaces like the sauna, the clubs, the bars, I think there was already a shock factor and sort of in the sense that the panel is usually too afraid to confront the issue because they wouldn't know if they might have the expertise to talk about it, or they might come across as insensitive because it's a very specific group of people. And I guess that's where the question of aesthetics come in, because in Singapore, the most sort of commonly proliferated visual/spatial image of queerness is the pink dot, right? Like this sort of group of people, this mass of people, and they have the pink sort of light up that forms an image. And I guess that is what we usually attach to the queer community within Singapore, and that is sort of a space that is attributed to them for that sort of like time, like that period of time and that particular place that they can sort of exist for that period of time. Yeah, so I guess part of my studies was to really look at what queer aesthetics in Singapore could appear as, and sort of trying to surface it so that people can sort of have an entryway into it instead of just being alienated, because I guess alienation is both ways, right? Like it might also be, in a sense, the queer community feels alienated because it's like a sort of self-antagonistic kind of thing. Yeah, so as I'm just speaking based on my own research. Yeah, so trying to come up with this and also trying to come up with something that was honest within Singapore's context, because I think if you look at queer/architectural projects overseas, they come up from that context of the sort of LGBT movement that have been progressing within their own context. Yeah, so I guess what I wanted to look for in a very unconscious way, I guess this is upon reflection, was trying to see how basically what queerness looks like in a spatial way in Singapore. Yeah, and I think moving on, I would like to further archive these spaces, because based on my research as well, these spaces come and go very quickly. They really disappear and then they appear, and then legislation or some scandal comes up and then they disappear again. So I think it is really an ongoing process of archiving these spaces and to know how queer people can exist in Singapore. I guess it's just as, not as simple, but that's the baseline for me. Yeah. Okay.
I just want to say something. Okay, I'm not trying I'm not saying because you're obviously this group of people have gone through things which are larger than. I'm not trying to say that architecture should not be about making buildings. Okay, surely that is a major route, and there's a major thing that we are looking at. But clearly, beyond just making buildings, architecture has always been a discipline. It's a leading cultural actor. The architect has always been that. And to do that, I guess that we have to be able to discuss, be able to see things that's much broader than to arrive at one way of looking at things, right? That we should be able to hold a conversation. And if we are in a position where we are able to talk to policymakers, we should be able to say, give a broad view. You know, it's like a bit like journalism, right? Where if you just give an opinion, that's an opinion. But if you're able to produce both the for and against and be able to talk about this in a very logical way, then policymakers will say, okay, this is not a person just giving an aesthetic point or pushing their own agenda. You're able to talk about it in a very open and intelligent way that has various positions, you know, and then you take your position. So I'm not saying that we don't need buildings. Obviously we do, but we as a society that is now going beyond 1965, that we left that long ago, right? Previously, we needed to do nation building, right? And obviously has gone beyond that, at least for your generation. So what next, you know? Cannot be just making nation building forever, right? It has to go beyond that conversation. And so I'm sure as your generation is doing now, that you have different things to talk about and different things matter to you. So you are also pushing the discipline. You are pushing the discipline. When I graduated, it was a different conversation. And that was when, so donkey years ago, but when computers came, right? And then we were struggling with it and what would happen. I mean, that's like so long ago. You have different things to talk about now, right? You have your own agenda. And surely each generation must move the discipline along. And yes, buildings are important, but then how does this enterprise of the built environment change with the different issues that become more pressing? How do they enter that conversation? And of course, they might not enter eventually. Like, for example, I did Edit Collective. If they started making buildings or like Matrix, they might have different perspectives of what practice could be, the hours of practice, how you pay people. I mean, there were all these other things that we don't talk about, right? Do people work 5 days a week, or do you work like 7 days a week, or whatever crazy hours people work in architecture? Do you do that? Is that ethical? I mean, these questions, do we have construction workers who come to us? How much do we pay them? I mean, these questions, all these questions are part of the practice. And they are politicized questions, which you will hold when you run your own practices and lead your own, and lead the practices that you will do in 20 years' time, right? I wanted to ask Mariana a question because about feminism. Okay, and I note that, I mean, even Nas and Yongchen, feminism is not about that you are a woman or a girl and therefore you're feminist, okay? It's not about that. I just want to ask a question about that because, well, I've never met you in person, but you look like relatively young. And how do you get to that position, right? Because I know that I didn't realize I was feminist until I was challenged. Okay, I mean, it really takes a life experience to then understand that you take this position and it matters to you. So how do you realize it? Like, because you're so young.
Thank you. Yes, it's a very good question. And I think definitely working with a group of people in Edit Collective who share similar values, that kind of reinforced my position. And today, my feminist position is very natural to me But as you said, feminism is not just about women. So we have to explain to people, you know, this is a position we're coming from, but it doesn't mean we're only interested in women, or, you know, we understand gender much more broadly in general. But how did I? So when I was in my undergrad course, I was writing my dissertation, and I wanted to write about domestic architecture because, well, I thought I was interesting, and I began to be interested in the layout of the home and how it came to be. And I started doing research, and I realized that there's not, and I took out my big atlas of world architecture, and I tried to find a residential design in it, and there was nothing, because it was kind of like a very mainstream world architectural history book. So it's kind of all the representational buildings, churches and institutions and public buildings. And that's how I first came across the work of Matrix. So I think that's when I started kind of consolidating and formulating these thoughts. And I started realizing that first of all, the design of our homes is not natural, that they are designed, and they were designed in a political, cultural system. And the way history is written by someone. Why is it written this way? Who is it written by? Who is it written for? And yeah, my dissertation was about the domestic kitchen and as articulation of the social. So I think that's when it started in earnest, but what you are saying does really resonate with me, because of course I'm not trying to pretend that I grew up oppressed like the women from previous generation in the same way. So nowadays the discrimination, not only gender discrimination, but class, racial divisions, they are much more subtle. But I think, and also just to throw that in, that reminds me of something Louise Scott Brown, Denise Scott Brown, wrote about the glass ceiling, that we almost don't really realize it's there until we hit it. And famously, Denise Scott Brown, her partner Robert Venturi received the Pritzker Prize, but she was never acknowledged in this partnership. So it kind of comes in those more subtle ways. But I think what our research is trying to do is to kind of trace back these legacies. So for example, when we talk about public toilets, we go back in history to research about how women were excluded. And that helps us understand why our built environment today is what it's like. Yeah, I hope I answered you. But maybe also less seriously, I was thinking about it recently when I was little, and I've got two brothers, and I think my first feminist thought was when my mom said to me, "Oh, you're a girl, but you're so messy," because my room was always messy. And I think that was maybe my first unconscious feminist thought.
Thank you very much. So we do have to start winding down, but because we've already exceeded the time actually, or a lot of time for today. But I do want to ask, based on like an extension of this question that Prof. Lilian has asked, right? Where what was the personal experience that resulted in this political agenda that eventually manifested in Edit Collective, right? Which is say that the student books today have a very intimate involvement with the methods and and personal interests of or integration perhaps with the communities that they are building projects for, right? Which is interesting, the contrast with architecture in general, which is very impersonal perhaps, or very distant from what they are doing, or from what they build and what they try to achieve. So now to you as an active design practitioner, Mariana, we'd like to ask whether it's possible to separate then that identity from your work. Like, could you have done it without the personal experience, or is it part of the necessary background? I guess the Prof. Lilian as well, yeah.
Thanks. I think, I mean, personal experience is important, but I think we all have, if we think about it, we all have different personal experience. So it's just kind of about realizing what they are and why they might be different. So it's the kind of moment when you hit something, whether it's a glass ceiling or where you hit a wall. And I think it's exemplified in many of your projects today, which are really brave in kind of poking at this glass ceiling or this wall. So I'm really in awe of that. And yeah, as I said in the chat, I've never lived in Singapore, but I think I realize what the elephant in the room is. And perhaps in the UK, we would ask more questions, but I'm also super in awe of how much you manage to explore and how much you manage to push against that sort of boundary. And I think there are some parallels between how we practice as edit and how you develop your projects. And I really enjoyed finding these parallels today. So for example, when Naz talked about the bed sheets, and that made me think of our laundry project. And so, you know, we can really connect. For me, that's another sort of intersectional symbol, you know, so laundry maybe it's linked to heteronormative family. So it's both kind of, it could be seen as feminist and queer. Sorry, I think I'm losing my train of thought. But yeah, I also just wanted to come clean and that I wish edit was my full-time job. It's kind of something that we pursue alongside having to make a living in other ways. But I think for us, it began in a very similar way, like things are unfolding for you guys right now. So you all took really interesting, strong stances on topics. And then we did that at university. We had those big ideas, and then we went to work for practice. And, you know, we gained other experience, which is also really important, but we weren't able to explore those personal agendas. And so we formed Edit, and, you know, it is a little bit utopian, I suppose, because it requires kind of working in the evenings and on the weekends and searching funding. But we're really happy with where we are now, because as Lilian mentioned earlier, you know, the question of how do you make it politics. And yeah, right now we're just feeling that because we came together as a group, we were able to carry this agenda beyond university, and that resulted in invitations and for example this invitation today. So that makes us really happy, but it's kind of experimental. I don't know where it will go, but definitely working as a group is a strength, I would say. Sorry, I'm not sure if I answered your question in a very straightforward way, but yeah, I just wanted to also conclude by saying massive congratulations and to all the students, and to emphasize how impressed I was with the projects.
Thanks. I think it definitely did answer the question. Belle, sorry, you were.
No, it's okay.
I'm so sorry.
No worries.
No, please go ahead.
Me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, anyway, yeah, thank you so much, Mariana. I feel like what you said is really true. There's definitely a big difference between the practice and between doing your own thesis. Your personal agenda may be like heavily like minimized in your practice compared to having a very personal thesis that you work on for about a year. So again, sorry to cut into this very engaging discussion, but we have reached the end of our allotted time slot for today. So before we close, we'd like to ask for closing remarks or perhaps words of encouragement. So Prof. Lilian, Mariana, and all of our students, you're more than welcome to stay afterwards in our Zoom room and chat about the subject or just to catch up. Yeah. So
I mean, if the students want to give closing remarks as well, like to your juniors who are interested in these projects, or like, I mean, it's not been an easy road, I'm sure, as you have said. So,
definitely.
if any closing things to say from all of us here.
I will maybe just say something very briefly, not to make us too delayed, but I would just like to offer words of encouragement. And these may be student projects, and sometimes it may feel like, it's just a student project, but I just want to let you know that they're seen and they're appreciated. And I would encourage you to keep your convictions going, whatever you go on to do. So well done, everyone.
Okay, so if that is all, then we'd like to once more give a very big thank you to our guest speakers, Marianna Janowicz and Dr. Lilian Chee, and our student presenters, Naz, Gabs, Rachel, and Chike, for taking your precious time on Saturday to be here with us. So once again, all the projects presented today can be found on our website, nusmmarkgradshow.com/2021. So as a final note, we'll be holding our final event of the Ahmad Grad Show series at the same time tomorrow, titled What's Next. So our guests will be speaking about alternative pathways and careers that leverage our architectural training in the domains of art making, curation, business, and academia. So thank you everyone for tuning in. See you tomorrow. Goodbye.
Bye.